All right, so today we're diving deep into a fascinating topic from the early days of Islam.
Right.
It's something called the Sutra.
Mm.
And a listener actually requested this after hearing about it on the Echoes of Ihsan podcast.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they wanted us to dig into it. And we're going to be using one of the most important collections of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, Sahih Bukhari, Book 9,
Okay.
specifically on the virtues of the prayer hall.
Excellent.
So imagine yourself transported back in time. You're praying alongside the Prophet Muhammad. What can we learn from their practices about focus and intention?
I think this is a great question. It's remarkable how much insight we can gain from these seemingly small details, isn't it? The
Yeah.
sutra, as you mentioned, might seem like a simple concept at first, just a physical object that's placed in front of a person during prayer.
Right.
But as we'll see, it reveals a lot about the mindset and values of the early Muslims.
So what kind of objects are we talking about here? Was it like a specific sacred item?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Okay, Sahih Bukhari mentions the Prophet using all sorts of everyday things as a sutra. A spear, sometimes it's called a harba in the text.
Oh, interesting.
A stick planted in the ground, referred to as an anza.
Okay.
Even the saddle of his camel.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It really drives home the point that it wasn't about the object itself being special, but rather that symbolic boundary that it creates.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You know, they didn't have noise-canceling headphones back then.
Right.
The world was full of distractions, people and animals moving about, so the sutra served as a visual reminder to stay focused. It's a designated prayer zone, and it helped cultivate that sense of intention and mindfulness even in the midst of, the hustle and bustle of daily life.
And it also shows just how practical and adaptable the practice was.
Yeah.
The Echoes of Ihsan podcast mentioned that even pillars in the mosque were used as a sutra.
Absolutely. The point was to create that focused environment no matter where you were.
Yeah.
And, that idea is something we can still learn from today. For sure.
Our world is even more filled with distractions than theirs was, right?
Exactly. So we've got this idea of the sutra as a focus tool. What else can we learn about its placement or how close it should be?
Well, there's a fascinating hadith. And remember, a hadith is a record of the prophet's sayings or actions that describes the distance between the prophet's prayer space and the wall being just sufficient for a sheep to pass through.
Okay, now that paints a vivid picture in my mind.
Yeah.
Not too far, not too close.
Precisely. It wasn't about isolating himself completely, but striking a balance between personal space and communal connection. Remember, they often prayed in groups. This spatial awareness, it speaks to the humility and consideration emphasized in prayer.
And it seems like respecting that prayer space, that zone of focus, was a big deal. Didn't Sahih Bukhari also have stories about people trying to get those prime prayer spots near the pillars?
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
It's fascinating how observing the prophet's actions, even something as seemingly small as where he chose to pray, became a model for the early Muslims.
They saw those spots near the pillars, the ones he used as a sutra, as being particularly blessed or desirable for prayer.
It really highlights how influential his example was, even in the smallest details.
Yeah.
So all this talk about prayer space.
Yeah.
What about the role of women? Was there anything in Sahih Bukhari about that?
There are actually some really interesting accounts involving Aisha, the Prophet's wife.
Okay.
The text mentions her sleeping, or simply being present, in the same room where the Prophet prayed, which challenges some later interpretations about women being excluded from shared prayer spaces.
So right from the start, there's nuance to this. It wasn't always like a black and white issue.
Exactly. And we even see Aisha herself pushing back against those who use verses about dogs and donkeys to justify excluding women.
Wow.
She argued against that interpretation, showing that even then, there were different understandings of women's roles in prayer.
That's amazing. She was clearly a strong, independent woman who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. It also reminds us to be careful about imposing our own modern ideas onto these historical accounts.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the context and realizing that Islamic thought has always been dynamic, with a diversity of interpretations. But speaking of respecting prayer space, there's a rather intense story about someone trying to walk in front of a companion while he was praying.
Oh, yeah. This one stuck with me from the Echoes of Ihsan podcast.
Oh, Oh, yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's a powerful story, right? This companion, Abu Sa'id,
Right.
was so focused in prayer that he actually physically stopped someone from passing in front of him.
Yeah.
And the Prophet Muhammad himself had some pretty strong words about this, kind of disruption, saying that someone who does that is a Satan.
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah.
You don't often hear that kind of language from the Prophet. It really emphasizes the sanctity of that prayer space.
Exactly. The sutra, as we've discussed, creates a kind of zone of reverence, both physically and mentally.
Right.
So walking through that space, it disrupts that connection.
Right.
And it's taken very seriously in these early accounts.
It's like saying, hey, this person is having a deeply personal conversation with the divine.
Right.
Let's give them the respect and space they need. So we've got focus, respect.
Yeah.
Any other major themes that emerge from these stories about prayer in the sutra?
Well, you mentioned earlier the challenges faced by the early Muslims.
Yeah.
Do you remember that incident we talked about, the one where someone placed filth on the Prophet's back while he was praying at the Kaaba?
Oh, right. The Echoes of Ihsan podcast really emphasized that story.
Yeah.
Can you remind us about that and what it tells us?
Of course. The Kaaba, for those unfamiliar, is that cube-shaped structure in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam.
Oh.
The Prophet was praying there, and someone, likely an opponent of the early Muslims,
Yeah.
decided to defile this sacred act by placing filth on his back.
It's hard to imagine the level of disrespect and hatred that would drive someone to do something like that.
Absolutely. And what's so remarkable is the Prophet's response. He didn't react with anger or violence. Instead, he called out to God, seeking justice and naming those who had wronged him.
Yeah, it's that unwavering faith, even in the face of such personal violation, that's so inspiring.
Yeah.
He remained focused on his connection with the divine, seeking guidance and justice through prayer.
And these stories from Sahih Bukhari aren't just about dry historical facts.
Right.
They offer us a glimpse into the very human struggles and triumphs that shaped the early Muslim community. They were a small, often persecuted group, and these accounts highlight the resilience and commitment to their faith in the face of adversity.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the spread of Islam wasn't some, smooth, easy process.
Right.
It was filled with challenges, opposition, and even moments of real danger. So we've talked a lot about the sutra as this physical boundary. Did the Hadith ever mention anything about a mental sutra, so to speak? Like how to cultivate that inner focus, even without a physical object?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
While they didn't use that exact term, there are certainly hints at this idea.
Cool.
Remember our discussion about Aisha and her presence in the Prophet's prayer space?
Yeah, she was even in the same room while he was praying. What does that tell us?
Well, there's a hadith where Aisha mentions that it was considered inappropriate for women to stand directly in front of men during prayer. She even describes how she would discreetly slip away from the foot of the bed if she needed to get up while the Prophet was praying.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about physical distractions, but also about maintaining a certain level of decorum and respect during prayer?
Exactly. It points to a deeper understanding of potential distractions,
Right.
even those that might not be outwardly disruptive. And remember, this was a time and culture very different from our own.
Right.
We need to approach these accounts with sensitivity and an awareness of that historical context.
Right. We can't judge the past by today's standards.
Right.
But it's fascinating to see these glimpses into the social norms and values of that time. It helps us understand the evolution of Islamic thought and practice.
Absolutely. And, this idea of minimizing distractions, both physical and mental, is something that resonates with many spiritual traditions, even beyond Islam. Whether it's called mindfulness, meditation, or simply taking time for quiet reflection, the intention is often the same: to create a space for inner stillness and connection.
It's like those mental sutras you mentioned earlier, creating that inner sanctuary regardless of our external circumstances.
Right.
But I think there's one more key story about prayer space from Sahih Bukhari that we need to touch on.
Oh, okay.
You're talking about the Prophet praying inside the Kaaba itself.
That's right. It's a really powerful image, the Prophet Muhammad praying inside the Kaaba.
Right.
The Sahih Bukhari describes how he prayed there, specifically mentioning pillars that were placed around him.
It's like having the ultimate sutra, being enclosed within the holiest site in Islam. What insights can we glean from this specific account?
Well, for one, it emphasizes the sanctity and centrality of the Kaaba in Islamic practice.
Right.
It's not just a physical building, but a symbolic representation of God's presence on earth. The Prophet praying there reinforces its spiritual significance for all Muslims.
And it ties back to that theme of sacred space, right?
Right.
We've talked about the sutra as a way to create a dedicated prayer zone, and here we see the Kaaba itself as the ultimate sacred space.
Exactly. It adds another layer of meaning to our understanding of prayer and the importance of intentionality. It's about aligning ourselves, both physically and spiritually, with the divine.
This has been such a fascinating journey through time, exploring the concept of the sutra and all its implications. It's amazing how much we can learn from these early practices, even if our own spiritual lives look different today.
It's true, isn't it? These stories from Sahih Bukhari offer timeless wisdom about focus, intention, respect, and the challenges of staying connected to something bigger than ourselves,
Yeah.
even amidst the chaos of life.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive for our listener who requested it after hearing about this on the Echoes of Ihsan podcast, what are the key takeaways we want to leave them with?
Well, I hope they come away with a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of Islamic tradition. The sutra, as we've seen, isn't just some obscure ritualistic element. It's a window into the hearts and minds of the early Muslims, their values, their struggles, and their profound commitment to their faith.
And beyond the historical context, I think there are universal lessons here about creating sacred space in our own lives.
Yeah.
Whether it's a physical sutra, a dedicated meditation corner, or simply a mental shift into a more mindful state, it's about being intentional about our connection to the divine,
Beautifully said.
whatever form that takes for each of us.
Yeah. And if they're interested in exploring these ideas further, the Echoes of Ihsan podcast is a fantastic resource. They delve into the spiritual dimensions of Islam in a way that's both insightful and accessible.
Absolutely. I can't recommend them enough. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to ponder.
Oh, okay.
In our modern world, with all its distractions and demands, what are the sutras we can create to help us stay grounded and focused? What boundaries can we set, both physical and mental, to cultivate that sense of presence and intentionality in our daily lives? How can we carve out those sacred spaces for ourselves, even amidst the busyness and noise? Those are questions worth reflecting on, and I encourage our listener to explore them further. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.